Deterrence decay across the Taiwan Strait. Is it real? And can anyone do anything about it? To discuss how to avoid World War III, we have on today Jared McKinney of the Air War College and Peter Harris of Colorado State to discuss their recent booklet entitled Deterrence Gap, Avoiding War in the Taiwan Strait. You know, there has been a lot of talk and chatter about this particular topic over the past few years, and I thought the sort of framework and argumentation that Jared and Peter laid out was some of the most structured thinking about this question, and am really excited to share and explore it together with them and you. Co-hosting today is longtime host of the Republic of ChinaTalk, Nicholas Welch. We're going to start out with a brief history of how deterrence worked in the past, go into why Jared and Peter think it's failing now, and what the U.S., Taiwan, and friends and allies should do to make sure that the, quote, conveyor belt of deterrence keeps rolling through the 2020s and beyond. Welcome to China Talk, everyone.
Hey, Jordan. Hey, Nicholas. We're big fans. We're happy to be here talking to people in Taiwan. They'll say something like, you know, we've been under threat from the PRC since the late 1940s. So we've had 70 plus years of scares. And so why should we be unusually afraid today? And in fact, the mood in Taiwan, with a few false invasion warnings aside, seems to be one of the status quo. Essentially, the PRC is a threat, but it's been a threat for a long time. Part of this is true, and part of it is not true. And digging into the history, I think, helps us understand the continuities and the discontinuities, and helps us answer that question in a more objective way. Contrary to many people's interpretations of the past, Taiwan, historically, from the late 1950s to the early 2000s, has been in a pretty secure position. In fact, Peter and I argue from the mid-1950s to about 2004, a PRC invasion of Taiwan could not have happened, because either it definitely would have been deterred, or even if it wasn't deterred, it would have been sunk in the strait. There would have been the proverbial million-man swim, and Taiwan would remain de facto independent. And one of the reasons people misunderstand the situation today is because they don't understand that Taiwan was actually in a pretty secure position for 50 plus years. And this secure position was enabled by a combination of Taiwanese and American military power. People tend to talk a lot about American military power, and of course it's real, but they tend to minimize Taiwanese military power during this period, which is a big mistake. And in terms of American military power, after the Korean War, we become de facto engaged in the defense of Taiwan from a communist invasion, and then de jure, or formally engaged in the defense of Taiwan from a Chinese invasion from the 1954-1955 Mutual Peace Treaty onwards. And as a result of the de facto then de jure commitment, we interpose U.S. naval power regularly in the Taiwan Strait in a dedicated unit called the Taiwan Strait Patrol. We station tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers in Taiwan. And later on in the Cold War, we actually put tactical nuclear weapons there, a fact that is now declassified. So we have a formal commitment, we back up the commitment, and then there's two crises in which China signals some aggressive intent in 1954 and 1958, and both times we essentially threaten nuclear war in response to PRC saber rattling. And in fact, nuclear war was not what China was interested in, especially since in 1954 and 1958, they didn't have nuclear weapons. So it would be the definition of stupidity to fight a nuclear war against someone with weapons when you don't have them, right? So this is pretty robust deterrence, even if there are some scares in this period. And beyond that, the role of Taiwan is significant. And this is what Peter and I developed conceptually as multi-layered, overlapping, concurrent deterrence. And usually when you talk about deterrence, you do so with a CE, like a singular idea. And one of our conceptual innovations that we want to try to push at people discussing this topic is to talk about deterrence, TS. In other words, look at multiple things and look how they could be positioning themselves to respond to different logics. And so there's the logic of American military power, there's American nuclear weapons, and then for Taiwan, there's Taiwan air power. And I always quiz my students, and I quiz, enlisted personnel I teach about, who got the first air-to-air kills in the history of air combat using precision-guided weapons. And the answer is not the United States. The answer is the Republic of China Air Force in 1958, firing Sidewinder missiles, shooting down PLA fighters in the Strait, achieving kill ratios of about 30-4. So the PLA wasn't competitive because they were firing guns and trying to dogfight, and they were being shot down by Seeking missiles, which we had transferred or sold to Taiwan. So the Republic of China Air Force at the time was awesome. It was sophisticated, and maybe even on its own, it could have stopped an invading Chinese force. But it was never on its own because we had this multiple interlocking concurrent situation in which, even though people like Mao were borderline crazy, deterrence was basically assured.
One thing I thought your monograph did a really good job of, and I'd like you to expand on more, is the concept of deterrence. You bifurcate it into constraints versus restraints. Can you talk a little bit about why that bifurcation is important and what it adds to our understanding of deterrence in the Strait?
In very simple terms, a constraint is something prohibiting you from doing something or limiting your ability to do it, while a restraint is something internal to your own mind, prohibiting or limiting you from doing something. And the example I usually use to communicate this is, my car says I can drive 120 miles an hour. Supposedly I have that capability, but through a process of restraint, I don't want to hurt anyone. I don't want to kill myself. I don't want to go to jail. I've chosen not to drive 120 miles per hour. And in the context of deterrence, there is actually similar logic in which people sometimes choose not to do things, even though they have the capability to do so. And if you have a holistic deterrence equation, you need to look at not only imposing constraints, but also creating incentives for acting with restraint.
In your monograph, you have a very helpful graphic with a chart that shows these interlocking constraints and restraints. And I thought it was very striking how in the 20th century, the US and Taiwan relied almost exclusively on constraints like US naval dominance and nuclear deterrence and Taiwanese air superiority. And then in the turn of the century, most of those constraints have basically disappeared. And we almost rely exclusively on restraints like China's positive expectations about trade with Taiwan, with the US, Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing capabilities, things to that extent. Can you talk a little bit about why the 20th century was so constraint heavy and what's changed going into the 21st century?
Basically, before rapprochement with China in the 1970s, there weren't a lot of positive incentives in the relationship. So basically, it was a sort of hard-nosed deterrence focused on constraints. However, once we go through this process of rapprochement in the 1970s, the potential for positive incentives is created. And this is true for first the United States and then for Taiwan itself, which beginning in the 1990s begins this relationship with the mainland that deepens and widens, starting, of course, at things like just sending mail back and forth, and then widening out to include tour groups and trade, and then, of course, a relationship of technological interdependence beginning in the 2000s, centered on Taiwan silicon industry.
I also think there's a simple answer to that too, is the policy mistakes made, especially by leaders on Taiwan, that they should have invested more in the military in the 1990s and into the 2000s and 2010s to maintain that external lock. And it was a mistake to rely upon self-restraint on behalf of of Chinese leaders. And you never know, right? The difficulty with deterrence is it's really hard to find observable implications that deterrence is actually working, right? You never really know what is deterring an adversary or why they're not exercising an action or undertaking an action that you don't want them to take. So it's prudent to make sure that there are as many layered deterrents as possible, leveled at your adversary. So even if you think or you hope that economic interdependence or Chinese concern for their reputation or something is working to restrain them, it's really prudent to still maintain those external locks. And I think there was a policy mistake.
Yeah.
For readers not familiar with these numbers in Taiwan's context, in the mid-1990s, Taiwan was spending 5+% of its GDP on defense. And then that number fell to below 2% until recently. And then in the last 2 years, it's gone a bit above 2%, maybe heading in the direction of 2.5 again, which is the right direction. However, it takes, there's a lag time between investment and actually procuring military power. And so we're just beginning the start of that lag time period. It doesn't mean there's been an actual effect yet, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, a few things on that. It's easier to spend money on a military when you're a military dictatorship. But another thing I think with this sort of like, what actually makes people drive decisions is like a fascinating and impossible question. And the dumb analogy that just like occurred to me is like, I really don't like using Twitter after 8 o'clock. And I have like a number of different controls where like sometimes I give my wife my phone. Sometimes I use this app called Freedom, who should sponsor ChinaTalk. But like basically the only time I really do it is when I have the like extra deterrence of me feeling really bad because it's the Sabbath. And I like try to keep the Sabbath at least by not using Twitter. And like, you know, those overlapping like things of decision, it's like sometimes some work, sometimes others work. Like me sitting here, I couldn't really even tell you what the, you know, tipping point was, except in like some cases where it's kind of obvious, where, you know, maybe the nuclear threat is the same thing as like, you know, God being upset with me or whatever. But no, it's a really tricky one. I want to, you know, focus a little more on sort of the decaying turns today. You know, there's a stock versus flows question here, where it comes to like just how risky it is. I'm not entirely convinced by anyone setting the sort of like point number of just how risky it is today, but I think you guys did do a fairly good job convincing me of that, you know, whatever like the deterrence power that you had, it's like trending in a worse direction. So why don't we take this time, I guess, for you to like make that case holistically of the 5 trends you think are most worrisome.
So a big problem with the current discussion on Taiwan is that we don't know a lot of things. We don't know what's in Xi Jinping's head. We don't know how exactly China interprets many trends. We don't know if we're reading whatever we can figure out about the PRC correctly. So there's a lot of ignorance, and a mistake to make is to, I think, approach the topic with too much confidence and make predictions that are basically your subjective interpretation, rather than pointing to objective facts that you can maybe try to break down and assess more rigorously, and things that can actually be falsified. And so a big part of what we want to do, and if we could control the debate on Taiwan, is we want to push people to analyze ideas in a way in which they can be proven wrong. And so part of our argument is we lay out at the end of the book how we can be proven wrong. And we're watching for that evidence as it emerges. And we can talk about, we actually have 9 indicators, which if they were answered in a sort of yes or no way, we would be willing to reverse our position if the majority of them, of our essentially predictions, prove false. And so this doesn't mean that we're going to be able to establish scientific certainty, but I think that this approach, which I'll explain here, it moves us away from just like hype and fear mongering. And the problem with hype and fear mongering is, you can only call wolf so many times and no one believes you. But if you've focused on certain variables and you can sort of monitor how they're progressing, then it gives you the ability, I think, to change your predictions based on data. So basically, we start with this framework, constraints and restraints, which has always been implicit in the deterrence literature, but it's never been really explicit. So we try to make it explicit so we have a more nuanced understanding of deterrence. And then we look at the constraints that have applied before and the restraints that have applied before. And the constraints that have applied before are basically focused on American or Taiwanese military power. And the restraints are correspond to China's internal calculations, their forecasts of the future, and other variables, which we'll dig into. We believe that the constraints that externally bound the PRC have mostly decayed. And that's a term that we've introduced and we think could be a useful term as well, because decay shows that deterrence is a temporal thing. You can establish it for a while, but then an adversary can try to circumvent what you have, threatened them with. And so deterrence decay has actually happened in a sort of quantifiable way. One obvious way which we can actually quantify this is that until 2003, 2004, Taiwan had a superior air force to China. Taiwan had F-16s and Mirage fighters, which in the 1990s and very early 2000s, fourth generation fighters were good. Taiwan had air superiority, and even though China was building some Su-27, Su-30 type fighters, they were pretty slow in development. Today, Taiwan still has more or less the same air force, even though the F-16s have been updated a bit. So in contrast, the PLA has fifth generation fighters, advanced air defense systems, advanced naval SAMs, KJ-500s, flying airborne radars, all of which pose a lethal threat to fourth generation fighters. So that constraint has decayed, it's been circumvented, and the Taiwan Air Force no longer is able to serve as one of the deterrents to a PRC invasion. The same happened with American military power. We went back and we read publications on American military power in the late 1990s and 2000s. And basically, if you read the literature there, if there's a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, there's only one right sort of American military response. I mean, you all maybe should take a guess. So they're going to invade. What do? We send aircraft carriers. Bomb them with F-18s, right? So we send the carriers. That's like the default American response, right? So, and the PRC developed a deterrent that circumvented the default American response, which is respond with shipborne air power. And beginning in the 1990s, and we actually know more or less when this began, and then extending to 2014 on, the PRC develops, this anti-access area denial capability that's basically based on missiles that can kill aircraft carriers. So that deterrent has been circumvented, and we're in a position today where naval-borne air power is probably not really relevant anymore. at serving as a deterrent. Oh, I need to say these are my opinions too, my and Peter's opinions, and not official opinions. It's just our interpretation. So we could go into other capabilities, but suffice it to say that in terms of constraints, they've mostly disappeared. Then what about restraints? And the restraints bit is important, and it's not talked enough in public discourse, talked about enough. So I'm really glad that we can stress it today, because some people just want to focus on the military balance of power, but that's a big mistake. And the restraints picture are, what are those elements that could incentivize the PRC to maintain the status quo? And if you go back in previous times, in the Cultural Revolution, people talk to Mao, Nixon, Kissinger want to know, is China going to invade Taiwan? And basically, Mao says there's a bunch of counter-revolutionaries there. Why would we want to invade? We have enough counter-revolutionaries at home. So that's a restraint factor.
Yeah.
And then
I love that. Chinese revolutionary chaos. It's like, look, if your army is fighting the people, you don't really have time to fight.
Yeah.
Chiang Kai-shek.
And
Yeah.
if you go to Deng Xiaoping's speech in 1984 on One Country, Two Systems, such an important speech. In this speech, he says, it could take 100 years or it could take 1,000 years, but peaceful unification is basically the way forward for Taiwan. Right, 1,000 years. That means there's a lot of time in which the Communist Party is going to act with restraint in terms of reunification. But then what happened to 1,000 years? Something happened to it, and we've actually moved to 100 years, and not 100 years in the future, but we've moved to 100 years since the founding of the PRC in 1949. And this isn't like our interpretation. This is literally what the third historical resolution from 2021 says, is that the objective is to complete the complete reunification of the Chinese nation by this 100th anniversary of the founding of the PRC. So there's like this cognitive shift in terms of like broad acceptance of a very long timeline, focus on peaceful unification that's shortened to, in fact, a period a few decades away. And this creates time pressures to seek unification even through non-peaceful means. And these time pressures are concerning in that they indicate a certain inevitability about forceful unification that wasn't present before.
You also identify, since the turn of the century, there have been 4 restraints in particular, which have been trending in the wrong direction. The first is the strength of the one China policy versus principle discourse. Second is China's economic growth. Third is the tech wars involving US, Taiwan, China. And finally, China's perception of a closing window of opportunity to resolve this dispute in terms favorable to China. Can you talk about each of those in turn and why those are trending in the wrong direction?
Actually, let's focus on 1 and 4.
Our argument is, and it's not a very controversial one, is that in order for the PRC to choose against invasion, the status quo needs to be barely tolerable, right? So there's always a cost of restraint as well as a cost of war. There's a cost of restraint. So what is the cost or what is the benefit of not exercising the option to invade Taiwan? So we covered kind of the costs of of war, and we hope that they're severe, and so long as they're severe, deterrence can hold. But what about the costs of restraint? And for a long time, we argue the status quo across the Taiwan Strait has been more or less stable because of this one China discourse. So obviously, there's a wide range of disagreement over what the phrase one China means between the United States, Taiwan, and China, and within those policies too. So we describe the one China discourse as kind of a constellation of understandings about what the political status quo is, and they kind of shift and overlap but there's this broad, kind of messy, muddled middle where leaders in all three polities could basically agree for a long time that the political status quo was tolerable. So from the PRC's perspective, what that meant was there was no international move towards recognizing Taiwan as a sovereign state independent from the PRC, especially not in Washington, D.C. So to forego the option of invading Taiwan was not tantamount to losing Taiwan in de jure terms, right? There was this theoretical possibility that everyone on both sides of the strait and in Washington, D.C. was at least nominally open to the possibility that peaceful unification was a prospect in the future. And we can, we go back and forth about how realistic that has truly been, right? But at least in the discourse, the formal political legal discourse coming out of Taipei and Beijing and Washington, D.C., this one China discourse represented a constellation of understandings about the status quo that was tolerable for leaders in their PRC. And we think that has changed. It's changed because of domestic political evolution inside Taiwan, which the United States cannot control, and we do not call for the United States to try and exercise influence over Taiwanese domestic politics. But Taiwanese domestic politics in society has changed, at least from the perspective of Beijing, that's the case. But more importantly for our monograph, there's a perception in Beijing, not an unreasonable perception, that the one China discourse and America's one China policy has shifted to or might be shifting. And that gives cause for concern in Beijing, and it creates an incentive or a pressure for Chinese leaders to start thinking about a resolution of the problem. If the status quo is not stable, if people in Washington are moving away from this kind of constellation of understandings of one China, what are they moving towards? And the fear might be they're moving towards a situation where some future American leader might move to bring Taiwan back under the American security umbrella, might move towards kind of a two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan understanding across the strait, and that's not tolerable for Beijing.
Follow-up question there. You've really done your homework. You mentioned the 27 firsts that American leaders have done with regard to Taiwan. For example, like Trump, before he took office, giving Tsai Ing-wen a call, John Bolton meeting with Taiwan's national security counterpart in D.C., Taiwanese Admiral Lee Ximing meets in the White House in 2019, just on and on. These kind of firsts that you think are obviously piss off the CCP and make it not inclined to accept the West's at best tenuous grasp of the one China principle as they want it to be understood. Sounds like your argument on the whole is that those are unhelpful. I guess the counter argument is, to what extent do these kind of moves from the United States or allies strengthen the resolve of the Taiwanese people? Because if the Taiwanese people had a strong resolve to resist any forceful move, that would be a ginormous constraint against the PRC in any invasion. So how do you balance those things?
My view is that resolve to live not dominated by an adversary is primarily something internally derived and not externally given. And my view is that America can't breathe life into, Taiwanese independence, so-called de facto, but that's something that Taiwan and its people are going to have to believe in. And, we tried to come up with 27 because we're trying to find objective metrics that we can try to assess, have things changed, have not things not changed. In fact, since we came up with this list, there's multiple new things that could be added, but we got tired of counting, to be completely honest. So we're definitely over 30 now. And by firsts, what we mean is things that have happened in the past 8 years that did not happen between 1979 and 2016, which is maybe the golden era of the one China rapprochement.
There's a trade-off, right? I mean, even if we assumed for a moment that would stiffen the resolve of Taiwanese people, it would come at the cost of something else. Like it would risk provoking or it would convince Chinese leaders that the status quo had already been overturned, right? And that would kind of be bad for deterrence. So the better approach would be to find ways to stiffen Taiwanese resolve, to and convince China of that fact, which I think people often miss. It's not so much that, I mean, I certainly don't doubt Taiwanese people's commitments to their autonomy, but my worry is that China does doubt that. So it's about conveying that, but finding a way to stiffen the resolve and convince China of that, while also giving this political reassurance to China that the status quo is going to be tolerable and sustainable into the long term.
If I could have one follow-up on that as well, that my tagline response would be, we need substance, not symbolism. And the truth is, most of these interactions are almost purely symbolic. And the problem with symbolism is that it antagonizes the PRC, it pushes against the established framework, and in fact, it probably does nothing to actually contribute to Taiwan's ability to defend itself. And when I talk about substance, and maybe later on we can get into very specific things the United States could do that would actually better facilitate Taiwan defending itself against unpeaceful unification. And these are things in the tradition of America's engagement with Taiwan. For example, I talked at the beginning about how we transferred Sidewinder missiles, which were awesome at the time and made a big difference. There are equivalent things we could do today that would make a similar difference.
I think there's the kind of like, there's two big variables, or big unknown variables on the sort of like Taiwan plus allied side here. One is like Taiwanese willingness to fight, and the other is like America's willingness to show up. And I think the sort of the best argument that you can make in favor of the sort of like, 5 Biden, like, oh yeah, of course we'll fight, like, getting onto the helicopter or whatever arguments, is that that sort of boosts that percentage belief in America showing up by however many percentage points in the sort of mental state of whoever's going to be making this decision in Zhongnanhai. What's your take on the trade-offs inherent in strategic ambiguity?
Yeah, Peter and I have a whole paper coming out on this, which you've not seen yet. That way we have something new to add.
Next month.
In which we argue that you actually get better deterrent effect from ambiguity than you get from clarity. And the way this works, as we develop the argument, we look at Chinese military writings, and basically, if the PRC believes that America is very likely to intervene in an invasion of Taiwan, then the PRC very likely will launch a first strike against forward deployed American units, logistics, fifth-generation fighters, destroyers. This first strike very likely would do a lot of damage and create basically a pause in American military power, which could be exploited to maybe launch a successful invasion. And so that's not a good outcome. In fact, we suggest that a better outcome is if the PRC doesn't know what we're going to do, and so they don't launch a first strike. And if they don't launch a first strike, then they load up 30,000 soldiers in amphibious vessels, 071s, 075s, Ro-Ros. They put them in the Taiwan Strait. And at that moment, if we chose to intervene, we could sink them all. And if we did that, then in fact, no invasion of Taiwan would be possible because we used forward deployed capabilities to achieve a decisive military effect. But the PRC will only get to that point of vulnerability if they don't know what we're going to do, and so decide not to launch a first strike.
Yeah.
And so, given this reality, We think deterrence is actually stronger if we can preserve overall ambiguity.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you're betting on the counter argument, right, is like those 30,000 ships going out into the brave waters, like that, like the counter argument is like the percentage of that, the percentage chance of that happening goes down. If the decision is not to do that and like hope for the best of, America sleeping or whatever. But that, you actually kind of have to start World War III to kick this off.
I'll just push back against that a little.
Please.
In that I think military commanders want certainty, especially in the PLA mindset. I don't think they're comfortable with tons of uncertainty. And the problem with not knowing whether you're going to lose it all is like, how do you report up? Are we going to succeed or we're going to fail? Your answer is we don't know. It might be catastrophic or it might be okay, right? So that's not, from a military commander's point of view, I don't think that's very acceptable. Instead, I think a military commander would sort of push towards certainty, which would be, we have to launch a first strike. That's going to enable us to safely sail our ships and then achieve an amphibious land. So if you can generate uncertainty about the overall operational success, I tend to think that's the more salient variable. Even though there could be a larger war, a military commander is focused on that operational point of view. There's more nuance here, so I'll let Peter come in on it as well.
It's obviously all very complex, but I'll also push back a little bit on this idea that giving strategic clarity or something in that direction would strengthen the credibility of the threat of American intervention and therefore bolster deterrence. Even if we accepted that, right, to put too much faith in that US-led deterrent, I think would be a mistake for Taiwanese above all else. Because what if in 4 years' time we have or 2 or 3 years' time, President Trump is in office or somebody after him who says the opposite, who says, I wouldn't come to defend Taiwan, or I don't know if I would, or if there's a war in Europe, a war in the Middle East, and people in China start to doubt whether or not the United States can muster the capabilities, and then it would go down, right? So the probability of a U.S. intercession on Taiwan's behalf would go down. So to rely too much on that U.S.-led deterrent, even if we assume there's strategic clarity would increase the deterrent value, I think would be a mistake, and it's much better. And I think maybe later in the podcast we'll talk about Ukraine, but I think one of the lessons from Ukraine was it's much better to engage in general direct deterrence for Taiwan to maintain a standing array of autonomous deterrence that it can level against China, these constraints that Taiwan can level, but that I think could be sufficient to deter China. I really would want to push back against this idea that only the threat of a cataclysmic world war is sufficient to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I just don't agree with that. I mean, I think there's less serious threats that can be leveled against China that is serious enough to make an invasion irrational and to stop one from happening. And those deterrents can come from Taiwan and regional partners. They don't need to be this U.S.-led, well, we'll fight World War III. It'll be ruinous for you, but it'll be ruinous for, but we'll fight it. I mean, Richard Haas and David Sachs, they wrote this article in Foreign Affairs. It was a great article. It was very sober and kind of an arresting article, but there was a line in it where they said, yes, fighting China over Taiwan would be devastating for the United States, even if we won. But they said we should threaten that anyway. And I think it's incumbent upon people who argue for that to then also say, so how do you make that credible, right? How do you make it credible to China that we know and we're admitting that it would be devastating for us to fight a war against you, even if we win, but we're willing to do that? And that's a very difficult threat to make credible in the best of times. But Jared and I think, especially in the case of Taiwan, because the usual commitment devices are not possible. Cannot sign a treaty, cannot or be very difficult to permanently forward deploy US forces now on Taiwan. And there's all the usual commitment devices that you would use to make such a threat more credible are very difficult, if not impossible, to do in the case of Taiwan. So for all those reasons, I think if I was Taiwanese, I would probably prefer deterrence to be kind of built upon a foundation that I was putting in place as in the island of Taiwan, and not something that who the heck knows is going to be occupying the White House next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Okay, let's bring us back to the other restraint variable we're going to get to, number 4. It's kind of like the Halbrand's, Michael Beckley danger zone argument that the window of opportunity is closing because China's economy, the trajectory doesn't look super good, and it's either now or never. Can you talk about whether you buy that argument and what implications it has?
Yeah, the answer is that we mostly do, but with a little more nuance. Basically, beginning in the 1990s, the PRC began like a long-term modernization framework that focused on investing in the future. And it didn't actually reap a lot of these rewards till about 2014 onwards. And so this led to many people underestimating Chinese military power because it seemed kind of insignificant. And then beginning around 2014, everyone's like, wow, this is serious. So it was sort of a 0 to 1 moment. And the reason is because there was a concerted Chinese effort in the mid-1990s to build military power for the future. And while this was happening, Taiwan was in its authoritarian to democratic transition and was refocusing on basically domestic politics. And America was in its wars in the Middle East and was focusing on short-term problems like how do you stop, explosive devices from destroying your tracks. And so China had this long-term program, which it successfully completed. And the completion of the program we're watching right now, which is something like 100 J-20s coming out a year, modernized support aircraft like KJ-500, KJ-2000, and then a very sophisticated Navy with advanced air defense systems and serious strike options, things that we haven't even done, like putting anti-ship ballistic missiles on to naval vessels, according to the DoD report to Congress in 2023. So this modernization cycle has produced significant capabilities that the United States and now Taiwan are counter-modernizing against. The problem is that just like China's cycle took about 15 years, that's how long our cycle is going to take. And so, as I mentioned, Chinese military power started really being noticed around 2014. That's when publications on anti-access area denial and things started coming out. And we have programs that are intended to counter-modernize against China. Things like the B-21 is supposed to be able to penetrate, defended airspace. Things like the Columbia-class submarine, which is going to be the greatest submarine in the world when it comes out, and new Army and Marine Corps capabilities, actually modeling some of China's own capabilities focused on long range and medium range and short range strike. All of these capabilities from our own counter modernization program come online around 2030 or after. There's an Army modernization plan for 2030. There's a Marine Corps modernization plan for 2030. The Air Force modernization plan is focused on this new bomber in the 2030s. All of these take time and money and establish processes and programs of record, all of which have been built and will be generated, just not now. At the same time, Taiwan is modernizing its military. It's moved from 4 months to 1 year conscription. It's raising its military budget, and it's looking to acquire some new capabilities which could pose a more serious threat to the PLA. All of that is going to take time as well. And the same story is happening in Japan. And I know you were just in Japan, so maybe you heard some of this, but basically Japan's military is building based on a directive to master counterstrike. Basically, the Japanese Self-Defense Forces is going to be a counterstrike sort of organization beginning about 2030. And the counterstrike organization will be able to, if Japan is struck, Japan is going to be able to respond with equivalent weapons. And this is going to pose actually a very significant deterrent long term, and is going to offer much better protection to forward deployed US forces in Japan. So the problem with all of the counter modernization activities is not that they're happening, but they're happening on a timeline that's pretty far in the future. And at the same time, China is at a pretty good place in its modernization program. And what this means is that it's possible Chinese decision makers could assess now is better than later. And now is better than later logic is certainly not new in the history of international politics. We saw similar logic in Germany, of course, in 1914. And that was focused on similar military modernization programs. Basically, the Russian army was going to be 1 million men by 1917. And Germany saw that, they read the newspapers just like everyone else. And they put the calculations into their gonculators, and they figured out they actually couldn't fight a two-front war and be victorious against both France and Russia if Russia had an army of 1 million men. And this led to basically a decision, hey, if war is going to happen, it has to happen pretty quickly. Now, are similar calculations going on in China today? We do not know directly. However, we can infer that they might be based on, I think, the military balance of power, which for the 2020s is pretty weak. And from the perspective of the United States, Taiwan, and Japan, but from the 2030s on is going to actually be quite good. I mean, do you agree with that analysis? Do you think Chinese analysts could read the trends differently?
My take is like, I think we had Mike O'Hanlon on maybe a year and a half ago, who had this fun paper where he kind of did the like back of the envelope, like best worst case scenario. My, uninformed sense of how you would come out on the gonculator is like you would need to get to 95.5 in order for it to really change, or let's say 80-20, right? Because I think at the end of the day, like, there's such enormous risk that it seems like the sort of, you were talking about like deterrence being helpful from like a military operational planning perspective. It's like, that's important, but like, this is such a like roll the iron dice thing that I think would be really hard for, Beijing, whether Xi or beyond Xi, to sort of talk themselves into the like, quick strike on Ukraine and like no one is going to care about this in 2 weeks thing, such that everyone, regardless of who's got the coolest fighters and how many of them, like, you're still probably mostly thinking about like the multi-trillion-dollar economic downside that you could face. So it seems to me that like all of the sort of military deterrence stuff is helpful, but my sense is that like the scariest thing from the PRC perspective is not like it's not even losing, like losing the war would suck. Having the war take longer than you'd hope for would suck. But like the sort of economic dislocations and implications for state stability that doing something like this, where it's not a fait accompli, where it all ends a week from when you start, seems to me to be, at least for the next few years, the most compelling argument against taking any dramatic action here.
I think we agree. And, the best solution for the PRC is to drop talk about reunification by 2049 and to go back to the Deng Xiaoping model, say 1,000 years. That's the So the trick is that do we have to take them at their word? And some people say, well, they didn't really mean that. So that's whether they meant it or not, I am not sure. But I do know you can read the third historical resolution and it says it.
Yeah.
And so my suggestion would be stop saying it. And then maybe she or someone can give a speech on strategic patience and being like dung and focusing on the long game. That's the game we're going to play.
So even if we were to, as your sobering chart points out, even if all the constraints and restraints have basically disappeared since 2020 onward, what hasn't changed is how insanely difficult it is to pull off the invasion. Like, tanks don't walk on water, boats aren't hypersonic, Taiwan Strait hasn't gotten any narrower, Taiwan hasn't built more landing beaches for the PLA. And the longer she stays in power, the more different Taiwan becomes, and the harder it gets to swallow. Going back to the quote you mentioned about Mao, like, Taiwan's not wantable. There are a bunch of counter-revolutionaries here. Like, that's increasingly becoming the case the more different it becomes. So I guess my question here is, like, how heavily should we weigh these factors, even if we concede that all the restraints are gone? Invading Taiwan hasn't become easier in that sense.
While it's true that the geography has not changed and the difficulty of pulling off an invasion in the abstract has not changed, there's a few things have changed. And one is that China it's become more able, all things being equal, more able to execute an invasion. Certainly not easily, and I certainly wouldn't argue that it would be an easy gamble to take. It would be very risky, very costly, as we discussed. But they're more able than they were 20 years ago, 40 years ago, something like that. And what's also changed is that these costs of restraint have arguably changed too. So you always have to think through the counterfactual of, sure, an invasion would be really costly and risky for us, but what's the costs of doing nothing? And the more American leaders talk about Taiwan as this democratic outpost that's essential to the defense of the Indo-Pacific, a critical node in America, there's the first island chain and stuff, that's changed, right? Or from the perspective of Beijing, they may think, oh gosh, right? The Americans they've changed the way they think about Taiwan, and even though it's not becoming any easier to seize Taiwan by force, it's become more important to do so and to risk doing so soon. Because if we don't, we're going to wake up in 5-10 years time, and the United States has recognized an independent Taiwan and brought it back under its security umbrella. And they weren't worried about that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but they may be worried about it today, or they may become more worried about it. So it's really important that people in the United States, I think, our leaders in the United States, say things that don't give the impression that we're intent on overturning the status quo. I think the one China policy that the United States has had in place for several decades now has been very good, quite good at kind of reassuring all sides that the status quo is tenable. And if the cost of restraint starts to look impossible for the PRC to bear, then they may take this risk that in the past they were not willing to take, but now they may be.
And if I could add to that, Nicholas, the truth is that an invasion would be incredibly hard. And we actually have good evidence for why. But I would just add to that. And it can be made even harder with relative ease. And that's where we would disagree with Brands and Beckley and analysts. We've read articles recently saying we need to spend 5% of our GDP on defense to get ready for this challenge. We've read an article saying we need to threaten preemptive nuclear war against China if they suggest they're going to invade Taiwan. That's from the Atlantic Council. We've read articles basically positing we're going to have to change all of our international relationships, change our domestic society. We disagree with all of that. We think deterrence is actually easier to restore. And we can go into details why, but first I want to go to that point on how hard an invasion would be. And there's actually good historical evidence for this. And I'm not going to steal my student's paper, but I just had one of my brilliant Army students write a paper. And he did a year-long investigation of basically this plan America made to invade Taiwan, then Formosa, in 1944, Operation Causeway. And he went into all the historical records from the Joint Staff and he read intelligence briefings from the time about how hard it would be to take the island. And basically, the island then held by Japan was seen as an important base, which could be used to bomb Japan as part of the strategic bombing campaign. And at the time, we calculated we need 3-to-1 force ratios to successfully take just a part of the island. There were 93,000 Japanese soldiers on the island, which meant that we needed close to 300,000 soldiers landed on the island in order to defeat the Japanese. And today, if you sort of move forward, there's 169,000 soldiers in Taiwan's military. There's the potential for reserves. Their quality is unknown. So let's say 169. If you do similar force ratios today, we're talking about 500,000 soldiers on the island in order to succeed. And then how do you move 500,000 soldiers when your total lift capacity, if everything works and nothing is killed, is around 50,000 a day, including civilian assets like ro-ros. And the truth is, in war, many of those are going to be killed, and you're not going to be able to land soldiers quickly, effectively, with zero casualties. And so the problem is really, really hard. And we chose actually not to invade Formosa because the costs of such an invasion were too high. And we think that objective assessment of similar variables today should lead to the same conclusion. However, we're not in the minds of Chinese decision makers, and we don't know how they're prioritizing different variables. And so that gets to that, how do you make it harder point? And it can be made a lot harder without doing extreme actions. And basically, this means learning the very obvious lessons of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine and investing in 21st century capabilities, which are basically centered on drones and mobile attritable missiles and artillery. And then older technologies like mines, which will need to be deployed en masse, and then prioritizing that reserve force, which is 1 million plus. That's people who've done their conscript duty and then are in a theoretical reserve. And if you can turn the theoretical reserve into a real reserve, then a successful invasion actually becomes impossible. Because if you take 1.5 million people plus almost 200,000 active, we're talking like heading in the direction of 2 million people who are going to be fighting against an invasion. To get a 3-to-1 ratio, you would need like 6 million people, which is much larger than the whole PLA, right? And there are ways to do this, and the right model to do this is Singapore's model. And in fact, a Taiwanese scholar, Shang-Su Wu, has written a book on Singapore's basically national service system and shows how it works and how it could be applied in a similar way in Taiwan. And if that were applied, we think you could get robust deterrence. And it doesn't require radically changing, very hard elements in the status quo in the U.S.-China relationship.
Yeah, you're at the end of the report has some good stuff, like you need tons of B-21s in Korea and Japan. We need to make the day after impossible, and U.S. needs to chill out. That's basically the concrete action items I took away from the monograph. Something like that, which is, cheaper than threatening nuclear war. So, yeah. I don't know if that's
I
what
would
we're
just
talking
say
about. We can just go to.
The most important takeaway, I think, would be, in terms of military capabilities, is we need to make sure we're phasing them temporally, which maybe is a too complex way to say it. In other words, we just need to be very careful of our timelines. And our timelines can't be great things next decade, not much happening this decade. We need to equalize those out and think of deterrence on a sort of year-by-year basis.
For sure. So I think, your framework and the arguments you put in your book, are very convincing from a let's deter the big one that comes out of nowhere. But, you guys, look, it's a 100-page book. I don't want to fault you on this, but you did punt on the sort of awkward, political logic entanglement, sort of escalation into something really awful. And, just thinking about the news today, right? We've had Iran and Israel kind of going at it for, 20 years now. And, these two actors have some sort of, I don't know, dance of death, which hasn't, ended up leading to like mutually assured destruction, thankfully. And am sort of worried that is not really the case between Taiwan and China. So, getting us into these sort of, I'm curious how you guys think about like the accident to the escalation to the blockade to the counter, run the blockade to 10 people die to 150 people die. And like, that's how we fall into something like this, as opposed to, someone in Beijing, like sitting down and making the calculation. And sort of what comes to mind, which is particularly scary, is like when you got the logic, reading histories about the start of Bush #2's invasion of Iraq, and then the fantastic book Japan 1941, where like the decision never gets made, but everyone just kind of comes to the like the bureaucracy is just like, oh, now we're doing this. And you never have, for whatever interpersonal reasons, where it's sort of awkward to be the one to dissent, or sort of bureaucratic logic from a planning perspective, like no one ever sits down and looks at the the theater commander who's like, guys, this is like actually a fucking terrible idea. So yeah, thoughts, reflections on that kind of like zombie walk into war that you could see across the Taiwan Strait.
Just making some general comments on that. I guess three things. One is there will be crises, right? We can be pretty confident that there will be crises across the Taiwan Strait because of domestic politics in the US, Taiwan, and China for no other reason than the unpredictability of domestic politics. So there will be those. So the question is, how do you get to a point where you don't see this kind of gradual escalation, maybe an unwanted kind of sleepwalking into a scenario where, as you say, an invasion becomes kind of inevitable and no one can kind of really remember how it became so. So the one thing is, there needs to be confidence in those moments that if you do de-escalate, you're not going to bear some terrible cost by de-escalating, right? And in crises moments, leaders can fear that if we don't take this moment to do something, then we'll lose an opportunity in the future, or we'll suffer enormous costs in the future. So we have to go now. So you brought up Iran, Israel. I was really concerned at one point over the past few days that Israeli leaders would take the opportunity is the wrong word, but the moment of Iran firing these drones and missiles at Israel during this crisis to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. Because I could just imagine, on the inside, along the corridors of power, some hawks making the case, this is the moment. This is our only chance. This chance to retaliate against Iran, against the nuclear sites. It will never come again. It's a once-in-a-generation moment where we can do this. We'll enjoy regional support. We've got a good excuse or pretext because Iran just... And it didn't happen, right? And thank goodness that I don't think that happened, right? The news is a little hazy this morning, but I don't think they attacked the nuclear sites. Why not? And I can only imagine it's because along those corridors of power in Israel, that confidence that we don't need to, right? We don't need to escalate to that level, because when this crisis is passed, our security and our survival will be still tolerable. You need a situation across the Taiwan Strait that when a crisis happens, and they will happen, Chinese leaders don't think we need to move, because if we don't, the status quo will change and we will have lost our opportunity. So it's really important that the political and diplomatic foundations are robust enough to withstand those crises, that when decision making is taking place in constrained kind of tempo, this pressure cooker of a crisis, no one can make the case we have to go, because we'll never get the opportunity to unify peacefully with Taiwan if we don't. We have to make clear that peaceful unification is a theoretical possibility in the future. You also, the third thing is you need deterrence, right? You need this kind of ceiling above which the escalation cannot go, because it would bring down some kind of catastrophic event. I don't think that event needs to be the threat of World War III. I don't think it needs to be the threat of American preemptive use of nuclear weapons. I think those would be bad threats to level, or improper threats to level against the PRC. But just as Jared was laying out, if Taiwan itself can adopt a military posture that just makes invasion prohibitively costly for the PRC, then you can kind of put those two things together, that the costs of restraint are not too serious, the costs of war are very serious, even during those crisis moments. We hope that the situation would never escalate in the way that things did in 1941.
So, Chiang Kai-shek and the politics of shame. So this was so Chiang Kai-shek, he has this diary which he keeps like his entire life, and he kind of has like different columns where every day he's like family, country, politics, exercise, what I ate, the weather, and then national shame. And it starts where it's all about like Japan and national shame, and then when he's in Taiwan, it's like Taiwan and national shame, and like how shameful it is that I don't have the main. And I do think there's such a ego, manhood, face, whatever piece of all of this, where that's kind of where I worry about the one China stuff, right? Is it's just like it's throwing it in their face, right? Like everyone knows Taiwan's been its own thing since 1949, and that's not like a fun fact for Chinese leaders and the Chinese populace at large to sort of like live in, right? And the concern I have with that kind of like window of opportunity, it's just like you're kind of rubbing it in a way which is unclear just how helpful it is. And we did a bit of the kind of like decision tree of your different percentages earlier of like whether it's more or less deterring. But my take is that like there is a decision to invade is going to be an irrational one, which will be made on sort of like emotion and getting, pumped up and like feeling like you're boxed in and like everything's crawling in on you, and sort of not having that mental exit ramp of like me being still able to go to sleep at night thinking I'm like doing best for the party and the country, but not like, betraying like the hopes of the people and my conception of like what it is to be a good leader, by allowing you to say, oh, maybe 5, 10 years, 50 years from now, like people are still kind of, keeping on and getting on, seems to me to be underweighted in the discourse. And, just as important as making sure you got your minds and you got your reserve set up is like having people feel like shit when they decide not to go to war. Seems like something we really need to be focusing on keeping in the minds of Chinese leaders.
I 100% concur. Like, Chiang Kai-shek, writing avenge national humiliation, and then also the element of face. And a lot of those issues were probably engaged with Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in 2022. And technically not a new incident because the speakers visited before. But the way in which Newt Gingrich visited Taiwan actually gave face to China. So if we could just think about those terms, and the terms you laid out here, is he visited the mainland first, and he met with important leaders there, and then he did a quick visit to Taiwan. He didn't spend the night, and he didn't do sort of like Taiwan versus China discourse. He did more holistic discourse focusing on actually positive overall relations. And so when this visit, I think, didn't take face from China in the same way that Speaker Pelosi's visit did, which opposed, democracy versus authoritarianism, freedom versus communism, and a sort of either or situation. And I think thinking in those terms and understanding that there's no need to throw fuel on the fire is a better approach, and it's certainly my preferred approach. And that doesn't mean, you surrender your position, but I think it means you articulate differently.
Yeah, and the evidence on this is mixed, but there's at least some polling evidence that ordinary Taiwanese understand this dynamic, right? And there's at least some evidence that people in Taiwan can express a little frustration or anxiety when U.S. leaders take steps that can be perceived as incendiary or unhelpful. I mean, everyone's security is improved when everyone's content. So I totally agree with that, and it's just the wrong approach, as you say, to be rubbing China's face in it. This Pompeo idea of put China in its proper place. Well, what does that mean? I mean, there's no way that can be construed in a constructive, kind of helpful way. It's just not. It's not useful discourse. But I certainly understand. There's a danger of going too far in the other direction and being too sympathetic and too kind of understanding of the Chinese position. The United States shouldn't capitulate, right? In that, rhetorically capitulate. There's a way you could go too far, but I, like you, and I concur with Jared and you, Jordan, that there's a huge risk to trying to humiliate and to cow China into submission that may well backfire.
Yeah, there's another reading rec. Consequences of Humiliation, Anger and Status in World Politics by Jocelyn Barnhart. My favorite chapter was about Khrushchev and Eisenhower. So her argument is basically like, they were about to have a summit where they were going to talk about sort of denuclearization, and SALT could have been a thing that started happening in the 50s. But kind of in the lead up to the summit, you had the U-2 plane that gets shot down, and Khrushchev, even after that, apparently in the sort of archives, it shows that he was okay with it until Eisenhower went on TV and said, by the way, like, we're going to keep doing this because it's important for national security. So like, that apparently triggered something in Khrushchev's brain where he was like, no, screw this. Like, we're gonna 10x the amount of nukes we have, and you end up going down a path where you get the Berlin airlift and ultimately the Cuban Missile Crisis. But like, had the American president even kept flying the planes but just not talked about it in such an obnoxious manner, it would have been easier for Khrushchev to sort of step down and not turn this into like a really uncomfortable contest of wills that could have brought the humanity to a really ugly place, and almost did over the course of the early 1960s.
So have you read this book here, WWIII, Democracy in China, The Coming Crisis? I really want you to have him on the show.
Okay.
So that's my ask, if you can invite him. But basically, he writes the book in 2019. He's a professor in Hong Kong, and he's watching the protests in Hong Kong take place. And he writes the book as a letter to the Chinese Communist Party, arguing that it's in the interest of the party to reform and change and introduce democratic elements. Because if the party doesn't, then it's dooming itself to a future secession crisis that might break the party. And so he doesn't argue through like judgmental terms or like moral categories, but he develops an argument which he hopes the party could understand and be convinced by. And I think that speaks to a similar approach. And, maybe Peter and I still need to work on this and making an argument directly in those terms.
Yeah. You slapped a Tzu Jiwei quote in your book about Taiwan, which was, if I'm understanding the vibe of the argument so far, it's just an insecure CCP isn't likely to be a rational CCP. And the point Tzu Jiwei makes in this book, just read a bit, there's simply nowhere for the CCP to hide when the economy is not doing well or doing less than well before. This means the Chinese party state cannot speak of economic crises in the same way Western democratic governments can. In the Western, in a strict sense, economic crises are serious disturbances of a market economy, and as such, presupposed a degree of separation between system integration and socio-political integration that is simply absent in China. For this reason, every crisis in China that otherwise resembles an economic crisis is directly a political crisis. So, yeah, maybe that's it. Yeah, one paragraph summary of, a point he's trying to make in the book.
So that's why one of the variables that we didn't focus on, which is fine so much, is like the future economic trajectory of China is going to create different incentives. And if the future economic trajectory looks very bright, then it suggests that time is on China's side. If the future trajectory looks increasingly dire and anemic, it's going to create circumstances in which, in fact, the party is held responsible. And in those moments in which the party is held responsible, it could choose to deflect the conversation by doing something more radical to change the status quo. And so that could be diversionary war. It could be something else. There's no inevitability about this, but we think it suggests the possibility.
I think there's like one of the points here is there's a micro foundation to deterrence. Like what specifically happens when an actor in world politics is deterred? It's individuals, their political calculus is altered somehow. So Jared and I did a podcast, I don't know, was it 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, with a critic of one of our earlier articles, and he said the only way to deter the People's Republic of China is to credibly threaten to grind the People's Liberation Army into the dust. And I don't agree with that. I think there's a micro-foundational, I think leaders in the PRC worry about other things, not just the PLA being ground into the dust. They worry about other things. The regime worries about its legitimacy. It worries about its survival. It worries about how it's perceived by the people. Individuals worry about things like shame, like things like regret. And you can manipulate those with effective deterrence in a way that stops short of threatening what I think is this fairly incredible threat of fighting World War III, and the economic stuff and some of the other stuff we talked about with kind of emotions and historical legacies. The part of that, what drives PRC leaders? Yeah, they don't want to lose a war, but they care about other things too. They care about their political legacy. They care about national greatness. And you can manipulate that, or you can leverage that in service of stability and the status quo. And I think that's what we try and recommend in the monograph.
Yeah. You wanted to run through your 9 empirical tests to see if you're wrong.
Yeah. So the reason why this is really important is because there's like a Xi mania when it comes to understanding China. It's all about Xi, right? But the problem is, nobody actually knows what he thinks in his heart on a lot of issues or how he's going to decide. And actually, his method of ruling China is to avoid coherent guidance. Because if you avoid coherent guidance, then all the decisions have to be brought to you. What that means is, you get to micromanage things because you actually haven't empowered people based on sort of principled objectives. And so I think we see this in terms of, he talks about self-reliance. On the other hand, he talks about, increasing trade. So which one is it, right? Anyway, the way to avoid Xi mania and get to a sort of falsifiable argument is to look at factors that can actually be sort of answered. And so we suggest 9 of these, though we're open to others. And so one of the things we're looking forward, we're reading and watching going forward, is how Chinese commentators, are they optimistic or pessimistic about unification with China in the long term? And sort of the place where we start for comparison on this metric is the essay by Jiang Shigang back in 2005, in which he basically talks about optimists and pessimists, writing in the Beijing Cultural Review about unification with China. And at the time, he's an optimist, and he actually identifies some metrics that you can use to achieve peaceful unification. And so, are Chinese intellectuals still optimists today? First question. Then another question we're looking at is, as Chinese economic growth slows, is Chinese military growth going to slow as well? And in fact, my view is Chinese economic growth is probably mostly fake last year, and was probably close to zero. But the Chinese military is still growing pretty robustly, I guess, at around 7% of GDP. So it looks like so far military growth is probably exceeding economic growth, but that's something we continue to watch in the future. China could also, number 3, not develop the capabilities needed for an invasion. What people talk about 2027 a lot, and a lot of that is tied to basically Xi being irritated, it seems, that the PLA doesn't actually have the sufficient amphibious lift capability to achieve a successful invasion. So it seems like he basically set a deadline, says, hey, you all got to make this happen. But there's other related technologies, and, are these being prioritized? And this can be measured by the sort of the ships in certain classes that are being produced, in the PRC. And then one of the variables that we suggest, time's maybe not on China's side. That's how we read the tea leaves, but are Chinese intellectuals and economists actually arguing that time is on China's side? In the 2040s and 2050s, is China going to be in a much stronger relative position than it is today? And then Chinese leaders could also emphasize this idea of strategic patience. And they could change their rhetoric on Taiwan and try to loosen that 2049 framework. And so that's something we're carefully watching for. And if they were to start loosening that framework, that would reduce our sort of alarm in the present. And then things in Taiwan could change as well. And obviously, one of the key variables here is what's going to happen in Taiwan's elections in 2028. And basically, the TPP and the KMT failed to form a coalition, as you know, for 2024, and that resulted in their defeat, despite winning 60% of the vote. Hey, 60% of the vote is quite a showing. And if that is replicated in 2028, that might suggest that peaceful relations could be extended further in the future from the perspective of Beijing. So anyway, we don't need to go into all the details, but we think there are objective variables that aren't just trying to get inside Xi's head, that we can try to measure one way or another to get a sense for whether we're wrong about the urgency of the present moment.
Here's the thing, Jared. I mean, you guys, your like wish list for Xi was like, yeah, let's start talking about 1,000 years and whatever. But isn't the real pro move to do that for 3 years and then do your like secret surprise strike?
Yes, I mean it would be. So that's one variable, and so that would need to be combined with what's happening with China's military. How much is it spending? What's it spending it on? And like these moments in which there are potential opportunities. And so, let's say Iran develops nuclear weapons, or the current situation further escalates in the Middle East in which there's an actual war. America has a lot of military power already in the Middle East. I think around 50,000 people. I don't know the exact number, but we have a lot forward deployed there, which is probably going to drag us into any conflict, regardless of the exact causes. And that will serve as a pretty major distraction, so that could create a moment in which there's an opportunity, especially since we've abandoned this sort of two-war idea that we tried to develop and defend in the past, that the United States could fight 2 wars simultaneously. So we got to watch for that too.
Let's do 2 more book recommendations, Jared and Peter, one each, maybe either on the topic or just like good thinking about hard things, which I guess is the other theme of this episode.
I have one for good thinking on hard things. It's an old book, though. It's by John Gaventa, Power and Powerlessness. And this book is a great book for people who want to study unobservable things, which is what you're doing oftentimes when you're studying deterrence. You're trying to study unobservable forces that you can infer their existence of, and you try and come up with falsifiable arguments for whether or not this kind of inferred force is in fact operating. And this book by John Gaventa is a sociologist, a political sociologist, on power and powerlessness. He looks at how power and the exercise of power over people it's invisible, right? But sometimes it bubbles up and is observable, or at least the observable implications of the exercise of power over people can be kind of seen or inferred or kind of tested and measured. And that book, I read that in graduate school, and it changed the way not only I think about politics. It's not even about international relations. It's about an Appalachian coal mining town, right, in the decades ago. But it changed the way I thought, not just about political science and not just about politics, but about how I think about the world.
My suggestion on China is one, you read and you sort of build a library inside your head, and new books tend not to radically change your priors, but one that challenged a lot of my interpretations was Yaxing Huang's new book, The Rise of the East, and The Rise and Fall of the East, I guess. And basically, he puts the Keju, or China's examination system, at the center of Chinese history. And he argues that the Keju allowed the Chinese state to basically promulgate uniformity and grow in larger and grow a larger scale, and that the super scaled state was strong but kind of anemic because the exam system incentivized uniformity, disincentivized creativity, and it channeled lots of ambitious people in the same area to become bureaucrats for the government. So he argues that in periods where the examination system was like more open to creativity and sort of less uniform, there was more inventiveness in China. But in periods in which the examination system became like highly uniform and you had to write essays in a certain way, like in the Qing dynasty, China stopped inventing so much. And then, of course, he thinks this legacy lives on today in China and the Gaokou system and so forth and so on. So what I don't like about the book is he sort of decenters the Song dynasty, which is the dynasty I find most interesting. And he wants to talk about the Sui and all that, like in the 6th century. But it definitely challenged how I understand China.
Awesome. Well, you'll be glad to know that he's on the calendar.
He is?
Of course he is. Jared, Peter, Nicholas, thanks so much for being a part of ChinaTalk.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.